think we're going to get started, and people can join us as I do some introductions. So welcome everyone to this special program hosted by Jewish Silicon Valley. It's Jerusalem to Gaza. Where are things headed and what is our role? I'm Diane Fisher, Director of the JCRC at Jewish Silicon Valley, and together with Maya Tripp, we are so privileged to have continually benefited from Israel Policy Forum as a brilliant resource on all things Middle East and related US policy, and in particular from the insights of our guest this evening, Michael Koplow, the Policy Director at Israel Policy Forum. But before we begin this evening, I have to acknowledge the tragedy of the mass shooting at the VTA rail yard this morning in San Jose. We are holding in our hearts the innocent people who lost their lives, and also the grief of their families and their friends. And you can see in the chat, there are ways to support families impacted and to make donations. Then also tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. in the plaza in front of San Jose City Hall, there will be a vigil where you can join to show your support for those who lost their lives and for their families. So to move on to this evening, we plan to have this program both as an update and reflection on the recent violence and crisis in Israel and Gaza, as well as an opportunity for all of us to ask questions. And I know many of us have this question: what is our role as American Jews, particularly now in the aftermath? And how do we support repair in Israel and Gaza? And how do we deal with the impact that this round of violence has had on us here at home for all of us? So of course, these are difficult questions, but that's why we have invited our longtime friend and expert, Michael Koplow. For those who are just meeting him tonight, Michael Koplow is, as I said, Israel Policy Forum's policy director based in Washington, D.C. He's a regular contributor to Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy magazines. He writes the weekly Koplow column. I'll turn this over to Michael now, but please write your questions in the chat as they come to you as he's speaking, and then we'll really take a significant time to see what we can learn from your questions as well. So thank you, Michael, so much.
Okay, thank you, Diane, and thank you, Maya. Always good to be with folks in Silicon Valley, even if only virtually. So we are now 6 days into a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas after 11 days of Hamas rockets on Israel and Israeli airstrikes in response on Gaza. So I'm obviously going to talk about the fighting that went on and in what ways it is, or I should say it was, different from previous rounds of fighting. But before we get to Gaza, I think it's important to talk about Jerusalem, because events in Jerusalem were the backdrop to the fighting between Israel and Hamas. And without understanding the Jerusalem issues, it's very difficult to understand why fighting broke out when it did. So to start with, there were really two issues in East Jerusalem that led up to the fighting between Israel and Hamas. One of those issues was Sheikh Jarrah, and one of those issues was the Temple Mount. I'll start with Sheikh Jarrah. So Sheikh Jarrah, and you know what? I said I wasn't going to share my screen, but Maya, I assume I can share my screen. Is that possible?
Yeah, you co-hosted.
Okay, so
I knew.
Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen for a minute, at the risk of maybe taking a few minutes longer than I otherwise would, but it's worth it. So Israel Policy Forum has put together a virtual tour of Sheikh Jarrah that we did using drone footage we took, and it's probably worth actually quickly running through it. Just so people have a sense of kind of what Sheikh Jarrah is and why it's important. So we are looking here at Jerusalem. This is from a drone that is in East Jerusalem above Mount Scopus, and I'll add some things here so people can orient themselves. Here we see the green line, and as I said, we're looking here, we're situated in East Jerusalem over Mount Scopus, so everything beyond the green line over here is pre-1967 Israel. And if we turn a bit this way, you can see right here is the old city. I'll highlight the entire thing in yellow. And there, as you can see, is the Dome of the Rock. And this over here is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. So Sheikh Jarrah, and if we look here, I'll add in Route 60, which is the main north-south corridor in the West Bank. So if we follow this yellow line out, this way it is going south toward Bethlehem and Gush Etzion and eventually Hebron. And if we turn this way, we will see it going north toward Ramallah and toward Shechem and toward Shomron, some area, the northern West Bank. Behind us over here is Mount Scopus and Hebrew University. And so now we'll go back to Sheikh Jarrah. So as you can see, Sheikh Jarrah is just north of, here's the old city, here's Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is just north of the old city, pretty close to the Green Line. Now, Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood that was established in the 19th century. In Hebrew, it's called Shimon HaTzadik. It's called Shimon HaTzadik after the tomb of Simon the Just, a very prominent Second Temple high priest who was buried there. And it was a mixed neighborhood throughout the 19th century. In 1948, when the Jordanians conquered East Jerusalem, and so anybody who was any Israeli Jew who was living here was kicked to the other side of the Green Line. The properties that were owned by Jews were taken control of by the Jordanian custodian of enemy property. And there was a deal in the 1950s between Jordan and UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, which is still the UN agency that is in charge of Palestinian refugees. There was a deal between the Jordanian government and UNRWA to resettle some Palestinian refugees in Sheikh Jarrah. They would be settled in property that had been owned by two Jewish land trusts before 1948. The Palestinian refugees would pay rent for 3 years. And after 3 years, they were supposed to get title to these properties. They paid the rent for 3 years. For whatever reason, the Jordanian government did not actually transfer the title to the properties. And this will become relevant because in 1967, when Israel conquered East Jerusalem after the Six-Day War and unified the two parts of the city, so effectively erasing the Green Line for the purposes of Jerusalem, the Knesset passed a law in 1968 saying that anybody who owned property in East Jerusalem before 1948 and then lost it to the Jordanian custodian of enemy property would be entitled to recover ownership of that property. Now, if the property had been transferred to somebody else, you could be compensated if you could prove ownership from before 1948. But if the property was still held by the Jordanian custodian of enemy property, you could actually recover ownership of that property. And these properties in question that are the subject of these evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, as I said before, were supposed to be transferred to the Palestinians who were paying rent, but never actually were. So this law passes in 1968. The Jordanians still controlled these properties. And as a result, the Israeli Jews who had owned the property before 1948 were able to recover ownership. Now, the Palestinians who had been living there, some of them signed a deal acknowledging the ownership of these properties in return for paying rent and being recognized as protected tenants. But not all of them were part of this deal. And so what is at stake now is the Israeli High Court deciding whether Palestinians who've been living in these properties and had stopped paying rent because they challenged the ownership can be evicted. Now, if we quickly go into Sheikh Jarrah, this is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. There's a video here of a CNN clip laying out some of what happened a few weeks ago. If we had more time, maybe I'd play it, but I won't for now. So if we go to the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, what you'll see is there are properties in red. These are the properties that are the subject of this court case before the Israeli Supreme Court. And you will also see properties in blue which are Jewish-owned properties, not subject to the Supreme Court hearings. And you'll see properties in yellow, which are also subject to dispute, but not the subject of these hearings. So basically, blue are Jewish-owned properties that are free and clear. Red are the subjects of the current hearing. And if you go over here, what you'll see is this is the actual compound of the Shimon HaTzadik tomb. And as you'll see as we proceed along, most of the properties that are the subject of this Israeli Supreme Court hearing are right around the Shimon HaTzadik tomb compound itself in this neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. We'll go a little farther down. Over here, you can get a better view. So this is the actual tomb compound. You can actually see here, for those who read Hebrew, right? This is the Shimon HaTzadik, the actual, the kever, the grave of Shimon HaTzadik in blue. And you see there are a number of Jewish-owned properties in blue right around the area. And also in this area are more properties that are the subject of this dispute. So again, you see the red, two red over here, and a yellow, which is the subject of a different dispute, undoubtedly come before the Israeli Supreme Court at some point. But the point here is that most of these are right around the actual tomb compound, because that is where the Jewish community in the 19th century was situated. And I'll go back to where we started. Go back to where we started. A few other things to point out. There was a clip on television that people may have seen of effectively a street battle in Sheikh Jarrah, where Itamar Ben-Gvir, who, if I can find it, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a member of Knesset from Otzma Yehudit, he had set up an office, his Knesset office, temporarily in Sheikh Jarrah, and he had set it up across from where a number of Palestinians were breaking their Ramadan fast, having their iftar meal, and it descended into literally a street battle. So this property right here, which is in blue, again, a Jewish-owned property, this right here is where Itamar Ben-Gvir set up his office. And if we just turn this way down the street, right over here down the street is where the Palestinians had set up for their iftar meal. And you can see just in this area itself, on this other side of the street, there is again a Jewish-owned home right next to one of the other homes that is part of this dispute. Again, over here on this side of the street, this is where Itamar Ben-Gvir was set up. Right next to it is another home as part of this dispute. So everything in Sheikh Jarrah here is sort of intertwined, and we have Jewish-owned properties right next to disputed properties, and all kind of situated around the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik. So I'm gonna stop my share, but I hopefully that little diversion was worth it to give people a sense of what it looks like, what it actually looks like on the ground. So the one thing I'm sorry, Diane, was that
someone asked one question. Allison just had a question specific to what you just spoke about. I was wondering, she asked who owned the land prior to the Jews owning it and then losing it in 1948.
So prior to the Jews owning it, it's unclear. There was two Jewish land trusts that owned, one a Sephardic land trust, one an Ashkenazi land trust, that owned these properties before 1948. So the one thing I'll note before moving on from Sheikh Jarrah is that in some ways this looks like a private property dispute, right? You have tenants who have not been paying rent. You have owners who say that because they have not been paying rent, they should be evicted. But it's important to note that the 1968 law passed by the Knesset is neutral in the sense that it doesn't say only Jews can recover property. It doesn't specify Jews versus Arabs. But it's not neutral in the sense that it only applies to people who owned property in East Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem only, who then lost it in 1948, which by definition means that it is only applicable to Jews. There is no Knesset law that provides for the same for people who owned property in West Jerusalem before 1948 and lost it to the Israeli custodian of enemy property, which is also a body that existed, to deal with Palestinians who owned property before 1948 and lost it. So that's why I'll leave it to people here to make up their own minds about whether this is a fair law or not, and whether this is properly termed as a private property dispute or not. But that's why you have this controversy around Sheikh Jarrah. Now, the Israeli Supreme Court was set to have a hearing on these evictions on May 10th, which is the day that fighting broke out, and also happens to be Yom Yerushalayim, the day, the Israeli holiday that celebrates the reunification of the western and eastern parts of the city under Israeli control and under Jewish sovereignty. So that's Sheikh Jarrah in a nutshell. The second issue in East Jerusalem has to do with the Temple Mount. And this was also causing tension in the lead up to the fighting. East Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is always something that causes heightened temperatures and oftentimes actual physical clashes. Whether it's the opening of an archaeological tunnel under the Temple Mount in 1996, whether it's Ariel Sharon's visits to the Temple Mount that kicked off the Second Intifada in 2000, whether it is the incident a few years ago where, in response to an attack on 3 Israeli policemen, the Israeli government set up metal detectors at the entrance to the Temple Mount, which then set off days of protests and riots. The Temple Mount is always sensitive. This year, we added to that was the fact that the past month was Ramadan. During Ramadan, you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who come to Jerusalem to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. And that in itself is always tense. This year, Ramadan fell out during the period that encompasses Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom Yerushalayim. So you have many Israelis also focused on Jerusalem at the same time as you have Palestinians focused on the Temple Mount for Ramadan. So what this led to was a series of decisions by the Israeli police that was related to the confluence of Ramadan and Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, and Yom Yerushalayim. One of the things that happened at the outset was the Israeli police decided to cut the power to the loudspeakers in Al-Aqsa Mosque that broadcast the call to prayer, so that the call to prayer would not interfere with a Yom HaZikaron, a Memorial Day speech that President Rivlin was giving at the Western Wall Plaza, and this upset many Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The Israeli police also decided to limit access to the steps around Damascus Gate, which is effectively a public square for East Jerusalem Palestinians, and during Ramadan in particular, it's where lots of people go in the evening when the fast is over to hang out and kind of celebrate the end of the daily fast. And the Israeli police had closed off access to those steps. And then on May 7th, in response to stone throwing from the Temple Mount, the Israeli police used more force than I think people are generally accustomed to. And so there were these scenes of tear gas canisters on the Temple Mount inside of Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's in dispute whether the tear gas canisters were actually fired inside the mosque or whether they were fired on the plaza outside. I shouldn't say the mosque, the plaza outside the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, one of which is a mosque, one of which is not. But it's in the dispute about where they were intended to go. But however they got there, they ended up in Al-Aqsa Mosque. And these scenes were widely broadcast and also caused lots of anger among Palestinians. And so you had this enormous amount of tension and violence that had already erupted. There had been days of street battles between younger East Jerusalem Palestinians and far-right Israeli, I'll call them neo-fascists, from a group called Lehava, that believes there should not be equality between Jews and Arabs. You had this going on already, and so all this really ramped up the tension. Now, this brings us to Hamas and rockets from Gaza. And it's important to understand the Jerusalem issue because when Hamas first shot rockets on May 10th, they shot them at Jerusalem, which was unusual. And they did so after giving the Israeli government an ultimatum. And that ultimatum was that Israel had to withdraw all forces from the Temple Mount and had to withdraw all forces from Sheikh Jarrah and cancel all evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. And this was Hamas trying to portray itself as the defender of Jerusalem. Much as it is for Jews, Jerusalem is a big issue for Palestinians. It's both a religious symbol and a political symbol. And so in a lot of ways, it is the most potent issue for Palestinian parties, not only for Hamas, but for its rivals in Fatah as well. And when you have this tension in Jerusalem, Hamas, looks at this and says, we're going to defend Jerusalem. And that is a popular stance among Palestinians, leaving aside the tactics. Just standing up for Jerusalem is a popular stance. And so Hamas was looking to take advantage of this. I should note, by the way, that also on May 10th, the Israeli Supreme Court postponed the hearing for the Shechterah evictions, understanding that it was already causing lots of tension. The Israeli government also rerouted the Yom Yerushalayim march that goes through the Old City and generally goes through Damascus Gate and through the Muslim Quarter. The Israeli government had rerouted the march out of the Muslim Quarter and out of Damascus Gate in an effort to try to tamp down some of the tensions. But that was done. Both of those moves were done, at the last second on May 10th, after a lot of this stuff had been baked in. Now, the other thing that is required to understand what Hamas was up to is internal Palestinian politics, because Fatah, which is the other big party within Palestinian politics and the party that is dominant within the PLO and the Palestinian Authority and the party that is headed by Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, was at the beginning of May, and I argue still is, probably at its weakest point since Abbas became the Palestinian president in 2005. The reason they are weak, many reasons, but the proximate reason is that the PA had announced that there would be Palestinian elections, 3 rounds of elections, legislative elections, presidential elections, and elections for the Palestinian National Council, which is the body that determines the makeup of the PLO. The first round of elections for the Palestinian legislature were scheduled to take place on May 22nd. Ahead of these elections, Fatah splintered into 3 groups. There's lots of discontent within Fatah for all of the criticism that Israel has and that the United States and that American Jews have of the Palestinian Authority and Fatah being corrupt and authoritarian. Palestinians have those criticisms as well. And the fact that there have not been Palestinian elections of any sort in 15 years is a source of deep discontent for many Palestinians. So when Fatah announced elections, this was a very popular move, and Palestinians wanted those elections to be held. And as electioneering happened, they increasingly thought that elections actually would take place. Whereas when elections were announced, 30% of Palestinians thought they would happen because they've seen this movie before. In the month before elections were supposed to take place, 65% of Palestinians thought they would happen. So it wasn't only that this idea was popular, it's that expectations had really been raised that these elections would take place. And ahead of the election, due to lots of discontent with Abbas himself, Fatah fractured into 3 separate lists, one headed by Abbas, one headed by his main rival, Mohammed Dahlan, who Abbas effectively exiled to Abu Dhabi a decade ago, and one headed jointly by Marwan Barghouti and Nasser al-Qudwa. Marwan Barghouti is probably the most popular Palestinian political figure living today. He's in Israeli prison, serving 5 consecutive life sentences for his role in orchestrating suicide bombings during the Second Intifada. Nasser al-Qudwa is Yasser Arafat's nephew, another very well-known Palestinian politician who used to be the Palestinian ambassador to the UN. Now, once Fatah fractured into 3 separate lists, there was no chance Abbas was going to let the elections go forward, because that effectively meant that Hamas was going to be the top vote getter no matter what. And so Abbas canceled the elections, which led to even greater Fatah weakness, because, as I said, elections were very popular. And Hamas was looking not only at the tension in East Jerusalem and the opportunity to stand up as the defenders of East Jerusalem, it was looking at this unprecedented Fatah weakness and calculated that if it did something such as shooting rockets to ostensibly defend Jerusalem, it would also have the chance of sparking an uprising in the West Bank, which, because of Fatah weakness, may actually topple Fatah and topple the Palestinian Authority. And ultimately, Hamas does not want to rule Gaza. What they want is to be the dominant player within all of the Palestinian territories and to be the dominant player in the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. And the way to do that at the outset is to replace Fatah in the West Bank and to replace the Palestinian Authority. And so Fatah had all of these calculations in mind. And as a result, on May 10th, Fatah shot rockets at Israel and started by shooting rockets at Jerusalem, which is a very unusual move. We haven't seen that from Hamas before. When Hamas rockets get shot off, they are primarily in the Gaza periphery because that's where most of Hamas rockets range go to. When Hamas wants to make kind of a larger point, they will shoot rockets at Tel Aviv. This time they started with Jerusalem. And then over 11 days, Hamas shot about 4,400 rockets. And 4,400 rockets in 11 days is also an unprecedented pace for Hamas. This was an effort to really try to overwhelm Iron Dome systems. And so the combination of rockets at Jerusalem, the rate they were being shot, and the fact that the IDF was caught a bit unawares by the quality of these rockets. Hamas rockets, as I said, most of them are pretty crude and their range is not more than 5 or 7 miles, which limits them to the Gaza periphery. They were known to have some rockets that had a range of 160 kilometers. This time, they demonstrated that they have rockets that they claim can go 250 kilometers, but they actually did shoot them a bit over 200 kilometers. They had rockets that went as far north as the Jezreel Valley, and they had rockets that went as far south as Eilat. So that means that effectively all of Israel is now under Hamas rocket range, which creates a danger from Hamas rockets, just in terms of coverage, that is similar to what Israel faces on the northern front from Hezbollah rockets, which are far more sophisticated. Those are guided precision missiles, but in terms of range, Hamas now effectively can shut down any part of Israel that it wants to shut down. So the IDF wasn't going to just let this go, with a few airstrikes and then going back to status quo ante, which is why you saw after 2 or 3 days, Hamas shooting rockets that were largely handled effectively by Iron Dome. Iron Dome had a 90% success rate over the 11 days. And after 2 or 3 days, Hamas approached the Egyptians for a ceasefire. Israel was not ready. It wanted to take care not only of the rockets, but also use this opportunity to go after the Hamas tunnel system in Gaza, which is known as the Metro. This is a system of tunnels that are not attack tunnels that are designed to go into Israel. These are tunnels that are designed to effectively be bunkers within Gaza and ways for Hamas to transport rockets and other material underground out of Israeli view. So Israel wanted to take care of this as well, which is why you saw effectively 9 or 10 days of pretty sustained Israeli airstrikes. And during that period, you also saw the reaction from the United States, which was not to call for a ceasefire and to give Israel space to do what it needed to do. After 10 days, on a week ago, last Wednesday, for the first time, we had a call from President Biden where he said he wanted to see Israel de-escalate toward a ceasefire. And you had Prime Minister Netanyahu respond by saying that Israel was going to keep on carrying operations until it was ready. But then the next day, lo and behold, you had the Israeli Security Cabinet meet, unanimously vote for a unilateral ceasefire, and a couple of hours later, an announcement from Hamas, or I should say an announcement from Egypt, that it had extracted a commitment from Hamas to abide by the ceasefire as well. What was really going on here behind the scenes was that neither the Israeli political establishment nor the IDF want to actually go into Gaza with ground forces. If that were to happen, it would look a lot like what you saw in the West Bank in the midst of the worst fighting in 2001 and 2002. It's very difficult. It's very costly on both sides. And so the IDF, and this is not new, this is now going back over a decade, the IDF is extremely reluctant to send ground troops into Gaza. And when you are confined to airstrikes, you have a limited set of targets. And after 9 or 10 days, most of these targets were exhausted. So, while this was presented as President Biden pressuring Israel and Israel responding a day later to pressure. I think that much of this was coordinated. Israel was winding down as it was. President Biden called for de-escalation toward a ceasefire, when he knew from Israel that it probably had about 24 hours left anyway. Prime Minister Netanyahu got to demonstrate on his side that he wasn't going to be that he was withstanding American pressure, because that's important for him for his own domestic politics. But both sides knew that there was about 24 hours left. And so the ceasefire was called last Thursday. It is held up until now. I expect it to hold for this round of fighting. And what's happening next is a conversation between Israel, the United States, Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, the Gulf states, and the UN and the international community in a larger sense about Gaza reconstruction, and how to do this in a way that will not empower Hamas, and that will not allow Hamas to just divert reconstruction aid to rebuild tunnels and to resupply with rockets. I'm happy to talk about this more in Q&A if people are interested, because part of this has to be not only about limiting Hamas's power and not letting them benefit. Part of this also has to be about making sure that someone else can benefit, because if you just try to limit Hamas, ultimately it's not going to work. You've actually got to weaken Hamas while providing an alternative. But that's what we're going to see over, I think, the next weeks and months. And ultimately, if the fundamental equation is not changed, we are going to see more fighting between Israel and Hamas down the road. That is inevitable. I would stake my reputation on it, whether it's in 1 year or 5 years or 10 years. This is now the fourth time we've seen this type of fighting: 2008, 2012, 2014, and now 2021. And as I said, unless something fundamental changes, the situation is going to remain as it is, with Hamas in charge of Gaza, Israel hoping that it can get some sort of short or medium-term quiet, and eventually fighting breaking out again. So that is where things stand. And Diane, I don't know if you want to manage questions, but I'm, as I said, happy to take any questions people have.
Sure, I want to encourage people to continue, and there are folks typing in, have already typed in a few, so I'll start with what people have already asked. And very interesting question from Steve, who asked, what is your perspective on the bombing of the AP building? Was that a strategic security target, really? And what is your take on that?
It's a good question. In some ways, it's a security target, and in some ways, it's not. So, the AP building, this is the 11-story building that housed the offices of the Associated Press and Al Jazeera and some other media. And according to Israeli news reports, also had a Hamas presence inside, where they had their own antenna up on the top of the tower that they used to conduct their own intelligence collection. That sort of situation is complicated, of course, because Hamas is using the building, but this is not the same as a Hamas command bunker or a rocket launching pit. And I think that in general, the Israeli government has a tough time with a target like that, and it's always got to weigh the benefits against the costs. The benefits are that if Hamas is using that for any type of operations, then you want to knock those operations out. But there is, as we've seen, undoubtedly a real cost to doing so, because you are striking a target that is, dual use, for lack of a better term. And I think that anytime that happens, Israel has to expect that there's going to be blowback, and that there's going to be doubts as to whether this should really be construed as a military target. And the other problem here is that the Israeli government was initially cagey about the building. It said that it had passed intelligence on to the United States ahead of time. It turns out that that was not the case. And then, a few days later, it passed on what it said was clear intelligence to the United States, and the United States said, we received it, but didn't publicly comment as to whether they accepted legitimacy of the target or not. So, I think my own view of this is that there are lots of military targets in Gaza. We saw Israel go after many of them, and I think that as opposed to focusing on whether this was a legitimate target or not, I tend to focus on whether it's worth the price that Israel ends up paying, not only with the United States, but in public opinion and in the international arena. And especially when you consider that the Israeli government often complains about media coverage of Israel, certainly going after a building that houses international media organizations, and perhaps the most prominent international media organization that exists in the Associated Press. It's hard to do that and then later complain about unfair coverage from these organizations, who are understandably upset when they feel that their offices and their own journalists have been targeted.
Okay, quite a number of other questions have come in, so I'm going to do my best to read them. I want to read one in particular from Yael, whose son is a student in my social justice class. And so she wants to ask about the Hamas stranglehold on the Palestinians and how that has caused the inability to seek solutions, and to how did they get this protector kind of role that you spoke about earlier?
Hamas is complicated because on the one hand, this is a brutal, authoritarian, religious fundamentalist terrorist organization, and on the other hand, they want to play a role in Palestinian politics. They're not like Islamic Jihad, for instance, which is, as its name implies, interested in nothing but Islamic Jihad. Hamas wants to demonstrate its bona fides in being a resistance organization to Israel and in committing terrorism against Israeli civilians, but also wants to play this larger role within the Palestinian polity. And so, for people who live in Gaza, on the one hand, the public opinion polling in Gaza is obviously tricky, but the polling that was done before the Palestinian legislative elections were canceled and before the Fatah splintered into 3 separate lists indicated something we've seen in the past, which is that in Gaza, Fatah is more popular than Hamas because the people who have to live under Hamas rule don't like Hamas. But they also don't really have recourse to get rid of Hamas because Hamas is, as brutal an organization as exists. There is no room for dissent, and there is no room to really challenge Hamas. It's important to remember that Hamas is ruling Gaza because they launched a coup against the Palestinian Authority in 2007, where they literally threw PA security forces off the tops of 10-story buildings. So this is not a group that anybody really wants to challenge, given what the likely response is going to be. But even with that, Palestinians are very frustrated with Israel. They're frustrated with the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank that is now in year 54. They're frustrated not only with the military occupation, but they're frustrated with what they see as an expansion of settlement growth in the West Bank and an expansion of settlements in far-flung areas in the West Bank. And they don't think that Israel is ever going to do anything to recognize Palestinian sovereignty or to let Palestinians establish their own state. And many Palestinians, a majority of Palestinians, look at the Palestinian Authority as not an organization that is bringing them closer to statehood, but an organization that after nearly 30 years of being in existence is effectively a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation. This is the dominant Palestinian view, and so they look at the PA versus Hamas, and they see one organization, the PA, that in their mind is basically cooperating with the Israelis and doing nothing to advance Palestinian statehood. And they look at Hamas, which again they don't like them, but they see them as standing up to Israel and as being the only organization out there, the only group out there that is resisting Israeli control of Palestinian lives. You can start to understand why there are Palestinians who are attracted to Hamas despite all of its other drawbacks. And so until Palestinians see a different entity that they view as one providing an actual viable path toward their goal of statehood and of ending occupation, Hamas is going to remain popular. And that's why, I said toward the end there, when I was talking about reconstruction in Gaza, if this just ends up being an effort to try to weaken Hamas but not provide an alternative path, it's going to do nothing to solve the problem of Palestinian politics and the problem of Hamas durability. Until Palestinians see a different path that they view as a viable one, nothing is going to change.
And Caroline asked a question, which I think is something that was very different this time, that people are describing as perhaps a civil war within Israel, of Arab Jewish conflict going on within the borders of Israel. And just that was a particularly sad thing to see this time, and wondering if you can comment about
so
that is happening.
Yes, so thankfully that is now under control, but I think that to me was actually the most worrisome aspect of the 11 days of fight, because that was actually unprecedented in the history of the state of Israel. We've seen Arab riots against symbols of the state, Arab riots against police, but when you see Arab mobs attacking Jews and Jewish symbols, synagogues, Jewish-owned businesses, Jewish homes, and then you see Jewish mobs carrying out reprisal attacks on Arabs and Arab homes and Arab businesses. That is what it looked like in the pre-state period during British mandatory Palestine, when you had ethnic strife between these two groups, and the British effectively threw up their hands and said, "We're out," because they couldn't manage this ethnic strife between these two groups. And the fact that this broke out inside of Israeli cities is enormously worrisome and concerning. And the fact that it's under control now is good, but I'm not sure that it's going to remain under control, because there are many factors that went into this. This wasn't simply sparked by the tension in Jerusalem, and it wasn't simply sparked by Hamas rockets, which were intended to inflame Palestinians in the West Bank and inflame Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. A lot of this has to do with changing Israeli-Arab identity, where you now have, depending on the survey, anywhere between 40% and 52% of Israeli Arabs who now describe themselves as Israeli Arabs, as their primary identity, not as Palestinian citizens of Israel, not as Palestinians, not as just Arab, as Israeli Arabs. And particularly in the past half decade, Israeli Arabs have really been asserting this Israeli identity. And it's different from Jewish Israeli identity. It is Arab Israeli identity. But they think of themselves as Israeli, and they want a larger role in the state. And we've seen this playing out in Israeli politics over this, now never-ending 4 elections, and probably about to be a 5th election cycle that's played out over 2.5 years, where just in this election cycle alone, we've gone from Israeli Arab parties who say, we are taking our traditional stance, we're effectively protest parties, we're not going to engage in the Zionist political project, which was before election number 1, to then, after elections number 2 and 3, recommending a candidate for prime minister, only the second and third time that has happened in the history of Israel, to then, during election cycle number 4, I should say election campaign number 4, actually putting forth lists of demands that they say need to be met, and if they are met, they will actually look to join an Israeli coalition. And one of the four Israeli Arab parties, Ra'am, the Islamist party led by Mansour Abbas, breaking away from the joint list, which was the amalgamation of 4 Israeli Arab parties, and running on its own because it took an even more hardline view in terms of saying, we want to be part of an Israeli government, and we will negotiate with anybody, no matter what, on the left, and on the right, or in the center, to join a government, because we want to be part of the process. We want to enjoy the benefits of being part of a government. We want full funding to Israeli Arab municipalities. So, we see all this happening in a very short time span. And, when Israeli Arabs say, we want to be part of the state and we are Israelis, and they view those ambitions as being frustrated, whether it's through passage of a nation-state law, which explicitly said national rights of sovereignty in this land are only for Jews, not for anyone else. And when they see during the fighting, Naftali Bennett, who was negotiating to be part of this coalition for change, the anti-Netanyahu coalition, say, I can no longer negotiate to be part of a government that is going to include or even have the support of Israeli Arab parties, you can understand why Israeli Arabs become even more frustrated than they were before, when they basically thought of themselves as separate. And when they said, we don't want to be part of this, and Israeli Jews said, we don't really want you to be part of this either. Now, that's not the only thing driving this. This was also rampaging mobs of 20-year-olds who, 20-year-olds everywhere tend to be the demographic that joins mobs and carries out mob violence. And so this is not, this is not unique to Israel or to Israeli Arabs by any means. And we shouldn't discount that many of them are indeed radicalized in real ways. But if you don't understand the wider trends that are taking place in Israeli Arab society and Israeli Arab politics, then you're going to look at this and say this was an isolated incident. And I really worry that this is not an isolated incident, and that if Israeli Arabs don't start to see some of their grievances and their frustrations alleviated, then we may see more of this.
So since you talked about elections, touched on elections anyways, and politics, I think I should make sure and ask some version of Marcy's question here, specifically about Netanyahu's motivation, whether there were political motivations for some of the things that happened. There's specifically things we read about here that Netanyahu allowed missiles to be transferred from Qatar or other places, and this kind of political calculus that perhaps played into what happened.
I don't think that Netanyahu instigated a war with Hamas for political considerations. But there's no question that he benefited from this outbreak of fighting. He benefited because there was a very good chance, probably better than 50%, that had the fighting not broken out, that this alternative coalition of seven parties, and then adding on top of that an eighth party, Ram, which would have been included or supported from the outside, would have been able to form a government that would have replaced Netanyahu. And Likud would have been in the opposition, and Netanyahu, because he's under indictment, would have had a real problem. And when the fighting broke out, that fell apart. Now, Yair Lapid, who currently has the mandate to form a government, still has until midnight next Wednesday to try and put something together. And it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that they'll succeed, but I think it's highly unlikely. And that means, that Netanyahu, if Israel then goes to a fifth election, Netanyahu remains prime minister as he is now, and I don't imagine that a fifth election in August will necessarily break this deadlock. If it does break the deadlock, it'll be because Netanyahu and the right-wing bloc is able to get to 61 or more. But I don't think it's going to create a giant shift of seats toward the anti-Netanyahu, the potential anti-Netanyahu coalition. So he certainly has benefited. You referenced the Qatari payments. So that is Israeli. It has been Israeli government policy under Prime Minister Netanyahu to keep the Palestinians divided. There's this idea out there that Netanyahu wants to overthrow Hamas. That is not true, and it is so not true that Netanyahu actually said this openly to a Likud faction meeting before the first election back in April 2019, where he said out loud, and it was reported at the time, said out loud we facilitate the country payments to Hamas, because if Hamas remains in control in Gaza and Fatah remains in control in the West Bank, it means that there can't be a Palestinian state because there are no negotiations while the Palestinians are divided. This is a deliberate policy on the part of the Netanyahu government to keep Hamas in power, but in a weakened state in Gaza, and to keep the Palestinian Authority in power, but in a weakened state in the West Bank. It's not an accident, and this is not a conspiracy theory. Netanyahu, as I said, has said this out loud. So, the country payments have been part of this. Now, this is, in the last few days, you have Benny Gantz, who's currently defense minister, publicly talking about the fact that this can't continue and that the country payments should be funneled through the PA. The problem with this is that you have to have Netanyahu accept this and go back on what has been purposeful policy to keep Gaza under Hamas control. You also have to have the PA being willing to do this without actually taking control of Gaza. And the PA and Hamas are not friends. There's the PA has its own sanctions on Hamas. So why the PA would agree to facilitate country payments to Gaza that ultimately benefit Hamas is not clear to me. So I think that if these payments continue, it's very unlikely to be through the PA. It's likely to be perhaps in some modified version, or perhaps in the version we've seen, similar to what's been going on. And just to be clear, these country payments come into Ben Gurion Airport, where they're then converted into dollars and shekels and sent over to Gaza. That is with complete Israeli government, not only facilitation, but participation, because the only way for dollars and shekels to go into Gaza is if the Israeli government wants them to go to Gaza. So, this has been very clear Israeli government policy, and I have my doubts as to whether it's actually going to be cut off.
I know we need to touch on something that relates to the American policy and our experience here as well tonight. So I don't want to get to the end without doing that. I'm sure many people saw Thomas Friedman's article today in the New York Times, and I think it was Steve who asked the question about the erosion of Democrat support for Israel and how the situation is really affecting us here. So I'm wondering if you can give us some advice. I'm sure everyone's hoping that there's some advice for American policy and for what we can do to impact that.
Of course. So I'll just say that Thomas Friedman's column today got it right that that working toward two states, is a big important part of this, and I think one of the most important things that American Jews and American Jewish organizations should be doing. With that said, every single recommendation he made in there for how to do that would actually make the situation worse, not better. And move away from two states and not toward two states. I'm happy to talk about why, but I'll answer the actual question first. What's going on with the Democratic Party right now is that you effectively have three groups: two very small groups, and then one big group that encompasses at least 90%, if not more, of Democratic officials in Congress. One group is relatively to the right. This is a group that is generally more reluctant to criticize Israel, but does not want to criticize Israel in any way, shape, or form, while there is fighting going on. Then you have a second group, which is on the left, that does not define itself as pro-Israel, does not want to be thought of as pro-Israel, has no compunction referring to Israel as an apartheid state, has no compunction to accusing Israel of committing war crimes, has no compunction toward calling for cutting off security assistance to Israel, even when rockets are falling on Israeli civilians. And then you have the big group in the middle, which, as I said, is at least 90%, if not more. And this group is pro-Israel, wants to be thought of as pro-Israel, wants to advance policies that are pro-Israel, is very concerned with Israeli security, but is also very concerned with promoting a two-state outcome, because they view this not only as smart American policy, but as the best way fundamentally to safeguard Israel's security and Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state. And what you see in this group is, and you see a shift. In one way, it's a shift. In one way, it's not. The way it's not a shift is that 20 years ago, you still would have had this exact same position within the Democratic Party, supporting Israel's security and supporting a two-state outcome. This has been effectively Democratic Party policy since President Clinton. But where the shift has come is that most of these Democrats look at what's going on in Israel, and they're increasingly skeptical that some of the more problematic things that the Israeli government does are connected to security. And they also see Israel moving away from two states very quickly and very harshly. And it's difficult to sort of square these things and think that Israel is still committed to two states when a year ago, I would have been talking to this group about Israeli annexation. And when two states is not on the Israeli agenda in these election campaigns at all, and where a majority of Israeli politicians openly say that they are not open to a Palestinian state at all, and where the Israeli right, when presented with the Trump plan, which called for unilateral 30% annexation of the West Bank up front, the Israeli right split because half of them said, wow, this is great. We never thought the United States would green light anything like this. And half of them said, no, this is not far enough because this still concedes the possibility of a Palestinian state one day. So Democrats in Congress, I think, are having a really hard time with Israeli government actions, which is why you see the vast majority of them who have no interest in touching security assistance to Israel, these measures to place new usage restrictions or to even condition assistance have gone nowhere and are going to continue to go nowhere in the immediate and medium term. But you do see lots of focus on Israeli settlement expansion. You see lots of focus on things like evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. You see lots of focus on Israeli demolitions of Palestinian homes, because for Democrats, they don't see this as being consistent with two states, and they don't see it as being related to Israeli security. And so, that part of this is not going to go away. And I think that if Democrats continue to harbor doubts about the Israeli government commitment to two states, you're going to see a lot more focus on these non-security issues and a lot tougher questions when it comes to Israeli government policy. And Democrats who are increasingly willing to criticize these Israeli government actions, particularly in as much as they don't relate to Israeli security.
I can't believe that it's about 8 o'clock. This has really flown by. There is so much. I'm sure we could continue this conversation for quite a long time with you. And I'm just so grateful that you were able to jump on and share your insights with us and answer a number of questions. Hopefully we can have you back, because we will continue to have many, many questions. As I'm saying thank you, I just also want to just highlight for folks that it related to this last question that you were answering, that we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism in our midst here, all across the country. It's not specific to just New York and Los Angeles. We're seeing in many, many places. So perhaps you can comment on that, and then I can just encourage people to join the Day of Action Against Anti-Semitism virtual rally that is scheduled across the country tomorrow. It's 1 p.m. West Coast time. You can just go to actagainstantisemitism.org and sign up and join that virtual rally. But perhaps you can comment in some closing remarks also on that issue.
Of course. Anti-Semitism in this country, as we've seen over the past few weeks, is scary, and it's a real problem. And it's hard to argue that it is not connected to the fighting taking place, because we've seen this explosion of attacks while Israel and Hamas are fighting. But none of us should ever accept this idea that somehow fighting between Israel and Palestinians or Israeli policy is a legitimate excuse to attack Jews. There is no universe in which that should be accepted by anyone, there's no universe where anyone should feel the need to issue a statement where they condemn anti-Semitic attacks in the United States and in the same breath condemn Israeli government policy, because that sends the message that somehow the attacks, can be legitimately connected to what's going on in Israel. They absolutely cannot. It is anti-Semitism to attack Jews, one group of Jews, because you don't like what another group of Jews is doing. And things are obviously complicated in terms of the American-Jewish relationship to Israel and to Zionism, and the fact that Israel is a Jewish state, but that we are not responsible for what Israel does. It can be complicated for us to explain and understand, and all the more so how complicated it can be for other people to understand outside of our community. But that does not in any way make it okay to translate anti-Zionist sentiments into anti-Semitic attacks. And we need to be clear with that, clear about that with everyone, without equivocation. And again, it does not mean that people can't criticize Israel. It does not mean that Israeli government actions are, not open to being judged. But anyone who thinks that is somehow an opening to attack American Jews really has no place in any type of legitimate conversation, and hopefully has no place in American polite society.
Very important point for us to close with, albeit a difficult one, but I appreciate your strong statement about that. And I appreciate the strength that I know that all of our viewers are having personally right now as they confront these issues in our midst, and also try to understand what's going on in Israel. So thank you so much, Michael, for spending time with us. Thank you to everyone who joined, and we will come back to more conversations with Michael and more conversations about Israel. So thank you, and good night to everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for having me.